Sandoval,
And I'm Lamont Williams.
and this is Playing Dread. And this month,
Have you seen a little girl around here? Short, black hair, 7 years old?
that's right, we are talking about the very first Silent Hill, and no other Silent Hill, which I think is actually probably the biggest challenge of recording any episode on a Silent Hill game. But anyway, I don't know. What do you think, Lamont?
You know what? I completely agree, but I'm also so excited to talk about Silent Hill and only the first Silent Hill because I feel like there's definitely some fun things to talk about, some things to unpack. This is going to be a great time.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think in a way we'll get into it. I don't know that there is an underappreciated Silent Hill. I feel like with Silent Hill fans, there's always a favorite of some sort. With that being said, I do feel like in a lot of ways, the original Silent Hill probably doesn't get the due that it is deserved. Maybe not as much as some of the other underappreciated ones we'll talk about in the future, but for today, just the original Silent Hill. And at the beginning of these, I always like to ask Lamont, what you remember about this game when you first heard about it, and also when did you first play it. So it's kind of a twofold question, I feel like, in this case, because I feel like with such a storied franchise like this one, there is absolutely the possibility that you had heard about the original game but didn't get a chance to play it until like after having experienced some of the later games. So I'm kind of curious what it was like from your perspective.
So Adrian, that's a fun question, and I'm going to do some time travel as I like to do sometimes. So, I was not a Nintendo kid for very long. That's where I want to start. I went from Nintendo to Sega, and when I had my Sega, I was playing games like Mortal Kombat and Chalk and the Forever Man. And so like the darker games and stuff like that really already kind of started to appeal to me.
You're already an edgy kid.
Oh yeah.
So early on, yeah. Also, great shout out for Jockin of all games. But yeah, go on.
I know, right? So going from Nintendo to the Sega, I will say that there was a kid who was like a friend of mine at the time, and I always kind of he was a little older, and I always kind of followed whatever he had. So he had a Genesis, and so I wanted a Genesis. And then he got a PlayStation. I stayed over at his house, and he had two games that like I remember distinctly. One was Exo Man of War, and the other was the Resident Evil director's cut. And Resident Evil blew my mind. It was like the reason that I was like, I need a PlayStation. And I begged my mom for it and I got one. And Resident Evil really spurred on something for me when it came to horror games. I don't know where you were with that, Adrian, but I was a rental kid. I went to like Award Video and West Coast Video and whatever places I could rent games. And I found Silent Hill just on the shelf. I had not heard about it. I hadn't seen the trailers. I just saw the box art and was like, oh, this looks like a scary game. And so I decided to rent it. And it was mind blowing. It was terrifying. I remember getting like I think to maybe the school and I was so scared to keep playing and I knew that I was like this game is amazing. When I knew that I was that scared that I was like I can't keep this up, I knew it was gold. Sorry, that was a long-winded way to say that I went into this game blind and I did not regret that.
No, that's super interesting to me for a couple of reasons. I think I've heard bits and pieces, not in the context of Silent Hill, some of that story, but I didn't know that you had played the first game originally like that, and that is really cool. There's actually a lot of interesting parallels to my story, including how I discovered Resident Evil, and it was a story I was thinking of saving for when we do cover the original Resident Evil, a game that's obviously going to come up a lot today. But what the hey, we're sharing. Why not? Why don't I just talk about it now? So Yeah, it's interesting because I had a friend. I was a Nintendo kid, and I very much was showing a lot of Nintendo tribalism, we'll say, with the Nintendo 64. Like, I had no interest in the PlayStation. I did not like what I saw of Final Fantasy VII as a big Final Fantasy kid and everything. So I was just, very stringent about sticking with Nintendo 64. But a friend of mine was going to visit their grandparents in Florida out of state and offered to let me borrow their PlayStation along with Resident Evil. So I
Oh,
played Resident Evil for the first time. I fell in love with it. Beat it like in the 2 days. Like they were only gone for a weekend. I beat it, and they came back and they had it for a while and couldn't beat it. And I was like, yeah, no, I destroyed this game. This is fantastic. And yeah, that story like is what kind of got me into horror video games in the first place, and also set me on the path of just being a huge Resident Evil fan, not just horror games in general. And now where we differ is that, you know, I said it before on this podcast. I'm sure I'll say it again. I followed video games pretty closely. I bought every gaming magazine that I could, so I did know about Silent Hill leading up to it. I know all the magazines that I remember at the time. The previews had kind of, positioned it as a different kind of take on the Resident Evil formula, Konami's version of this genre over Capcom's. Now, I will say my memory is a little bit fuzzy. I was also a rental kid because, I don't think either you or me, it's not like we had like really nice upbringings like some of the other kids we knew. Couldn't just get every game new, but I do think I bought this game. I might have rented it the first time I played it, but I might have bought it. Not 100% sure. I did own it, one way or the other fairly quickly, not too long after it came out. And one thing that I do remember from playing through it and really, really enjoying it was it's a very puzzle heavy game. We're going to talk about the gameplay and all of that in a little bit. But I remember playing the game alongside of a guide. I forget which gaming magazine it was, and unfortunately in my research I didn't have time to like sift through all the gaming magazines to see if I could figure out which one it was. But I was playing the game alongside with a guide. And the
okay.
guide, towards the end of the game, I don't know if you remember this, there is a puzzle involving zodiac symbols and numbers alongside a riddle you have to figure out to be able to figure out the 3-digit combination to something.
No, I do not remember that.
Long story short, the solution that was in the guide I was reading was wrong. And it was wrong because it was based off of a pre-release version of the game. I would find out years later.
Oh, that's interesting.
And well, again, we're going to get into like kind of the puzzle difficulty and things, but I will say that like this game the puzzles gave me a lot of difficulty as a kid. And what I ended up doing was just strong arming it. Like I was like, all right, 1-1-1. No, dang. 1-1-2. Dang. And I
Oh,
just did it that
man.
way. It took, if I remember correctly, it took about an hour and a half because I think that if I remember, and I could look this up obviously, but no, we're just going by memory. I'm pretty sure that like the first digit is 6, so it took a little bit of time.
That is amazing.
Yeah, no, I think that just kind of getting started before we like jump into like development history and such. I think that is safe to say that we're both pretty big fans of this series overall now. I didn't become a huge fan of it until 2, I will say. But that being said, the whole reason that I bought Silent Hill 2, which I absolutely did buy at launch, I had disposable income. That was a major pickup for me. Like I was super excited about that game because I played the first one. And it really was the second one that I think is what like cemented me as a lifelong Silent Hill fan, as a lot of people will say. But we're not talking about the second one today. I just wanted to bring up that like as far as lasting impressions go, this was probably one of my favorite or most well remembered horror games at the time. But I don't think that it like reached the same fervor that Resident Evil had for me when I was in high school, until I started playing the sequels. So I don't know if that matches your experience though, mine. As you said, you were like like really into it just from like the experience at the school.
Oh yeah, no, like I was super into Silent Hill. And I know we're not talking too much about the sequels, but we do have to kind of mention the sequel a little in that when the sequel came out, I'm pretty sure I also owned it pretty early.
Yeah, no, it is interesting to me simply because, my memory, or at least the way that like it kind of felt like was the popular history from when the second game got released, is that like Silent Hill didn't really hit its stride until that second game came out. And that's when everyone went fanatic about it. We again we'll do a 2 podcast someday in the near future, I'm sure. But that was the game that like really made the franchise take off. But if you look at the sales numbers, what you quickly learn is that Silent Hill 1 outsold the second game, and so did the third game.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so really it's kind of the other way around. I think Silent Hill has just kind of always been a thing. We'll dissect the cultural impact of 2 when we discuss 2, because it definitely feels like that's the game that like really solidifies what Silent Hill is. One of the things that I think we're going to get into when as we're talking about this first game is that one of the things that I think really makes it a unique experience is that, it wasn't designed with a sequel in mind. No one knew if it was going to be hit or not. And it is a very unique experience because the things that make the Silent Hill brand were not set yet. So this is a very unique game compared to the future titles.
No, I completely agree with you, and like how we got this game and like the development that it went through. All of those, I guess we'll call the hallmarks of Silent Hill, really it was not there at first. Like we definitely got from point A to C in a weird way.
Yeah, so let's jump into the prehistory of this game. And before we do, big shout out. I think not the first time that we've mentioned his YouTube channel on this page. TheGamingMuse did a lot of legwork. There were already a lot of development histories and different interviews and stuff that had been translated out there on the internet before the Gaming Muse YouTube channel kind of took up the mantle of like trying to compile it into something that like makes a linear story that makes a lot of sense. Now they did this through several videos, but they recently compiled all of their historical documentation of the original Silent Hill into what essentially works out to be a 2-hour documentary that we're going to be leaning a little heavy on for this section. We're like definitely going to kind of analyze some certain bits of it. Not going to do a full recap, but I do highly, highly recommend that you check out the Gaming Muses documentary if you're interested in the full story of how this game came to be. That'll be linked in the show notes.
Thank you, Adrian, because yeah, the Gaming Muse like truly put a lot of work into that, and it's quite incredible. And also, I want to just say like inspiring in some kind of way, getting the story of like how we got Silent Hill. So once again, as Adrian said, I also truly want to thank Gaming Muse because a lot of work got put into that.
I'll also say that he, if you're not interested in a video, maybe you'd rather read about it. They also compiled all of that information into a book that you can buy as well. A book that I own. It is behind me. I have not read it, though I have, obviously I've watched the documentary once in my free time, and also once again for this research. But you can also get it in book form, so I'll also make sure that that is in the show notes as well. And I think mentioning the Muse's documentary work means that I'm kind of obligated to just kind of put out there. We're gonna be busting some very popular myths today, and one of the first ones I want to put out there, as we get into this, is that there's no such thing as Team Silent. Like, before we even get started with this, let's just put that right on the table. Like, Team Silent, this like mythical idea of this like one team that like spurred the direction of the first 4 games, like the internal Konami team in Japan. Yeah, like there are some people, only really a couple of them I think were on staff for all 4 games. But they change out pretty frequently
And pretty fast.
and pretty fast. Yeah, there's no set Team Silent. And like with this game in particular, like its main director only ever worked on this one game. That is Keiichiro Toyama. So again, we're not gonna like completely recap the Muses video. I really just kind of get some of the major talking points out of the way. I mean, the biggest thing here is that Capcom released Resident Evil. Resident Evil made a lot of money, and again, that's a story for another day. But with one similar parallel to where the Silent Hill story is going to go, started as a B project that wasn't really expected to be super successful, and then was super successful. And Konami saw that, and Konami said, "Okay, we also want to make a horror game." So Keiichiro Toyama eventually gets put onto that project. There is a lot of little details that kind of lead up to Toyama getting the role. Helps that they were already a horror fan, in particular psychological horror from directors like, wait for it, Dario Argento.
Always Argento.
Always Argento. It always comes back to Argento. Not just Argento, like one of the things we're going to get into is that it's almost going to be impossible for us to actually mention every single influence
Oh,
that goes into Silent Hill. Like literally impossible.
absolutely impossible. But I don't know. There's something I want to talk about, and I'm not sure when the best time is.
Oh, well, might as well jump in now and we'll go from there.
Sounds good. What I think is interesting is that when we're talking about influences and the time period, the 90s and the Japanese occult like boom, that fascination and how much influence that has had and honestly continues to have on games, media, and movies and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that we've kind of moved into a period, and anyone who is more familiar with Japanese pop culture can feel free to correct me. I feel like over the years we've moved into a period where a lot of the influence from it now is primarily the influence of the work of the 80s and 90s that itself was a part of that occult boom. And we've mentioned this in this podcast before. Clock Tower, I think, is like a really good example of a game that, it has that Argento vibe. It is, we talked about it was essentially the Argento video game, but it also has a story that touches on occultism in the same way that, like, say, Megami Tensei, another series that we're going to talk about in a future podcast. Yeah, no, absolutely. That the occult boom had been a big thing throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, really. You see it pop up quite a bit in Japanese pop culture, Japanese horror, sometimes even Japanese sci-fi. And yeah, no, absolutely. Like, the combination of all of these developers who were on the original Silent Hill, including Toyama, all of them were basically fans of horror short stories and Western occultism, and all of that ends up being part of the I don't know if what best way to describe Silent Hill, a melting pot, a stew of all of these incredible influences. Absolutely, for sure. I think it is worth mentioning at this stage that, like, when the game was like kind of first getting on track, they're just kind of prototyping stuff the way that game developers do. Don't really know what exactly the game is. They just know that it's going to be a Resident Evil like of some sort, of some variety. So, third person action game. horror elements, horror themes. I think that they decide pretty early on that they want to differentiate itself from Resident Evil, that they want to lean a little bit more towards psychological horror and thriller movies. Now, we already mentioned Argento. This would also include things like the occult films, like, say, The Omen, which, apart from just having a very distinct like look and feel, also has a bit of a conspiracy twist to it. Jacob's Ladder, of course, is a really big one that we'll probably mention a little bit later on, as well as probably every Silent Hill podcast will get a mention of Jacob's Ladder at some
Oh, yes,
point.
absolutely.
But at that point, it was just kind of like trying to figure out the vibe of it. But the big thing that really kind of starts to push the game in a direction, kind of like the Alone in the Dark podcast, on it, like what we said with Alone in the Dark, that actually had more to do with the technology than anything else, was that one of the tech people who's mentioned in the video, I don't remember what their name was, figured out how to do a point light on the PlayStation.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Now, I don't want to like dig too deep into technical details that I only have a cursory understanding of as a game developer, right? But like, I know that if I jump into Unity or Unreal, I want to create a point light. It's as easy as like opening up in a menu and say insert point light, and that's it. That kind of real-time lighting on the PlayStation was unheard of. It's absolutely unheard of that they were able to do something like that, and so early on, when like they don't even know what this game is yet. The problem was that by having this point light in the scene, either the game is going to run really, really slowly, or basically everything has to be really dark. A concept that's kind of known as draw distance. Again, don't want to get too deep into the technical weeds, but the idea being that, like, whenever you see a game where you can only see so far off into the distance and then everything is just kind of like a fog, that's why they create these kind of like fog style effects. It's because to draw anything else on the screen would make the game unplayable. That's why they do it. So the decision to have both a point light that can only really render so much on the screen is what leads them to be, okay, we're going to do a game about darkness then. Resident Evil, by contrast, is actually a very bright game. There's not really much darkness. There's no real-time lighting in that game, right?
Oh, yeah.
Here, we actually have lights. We're going to do everything in full 3D. We're not going to do pre-rendered backgrounds like in Alone in the Dark or Resident Evil. But in order to do that, we can only like limit what you can see for so far. So that's how we get dark sequences. The rest of the game actually make it more fitting. Probably the thing I think like surprises a lot of people when they first hear it is that originally this game was going to be a licensed game, and they had 3 licenses to choose from. I only remember 2 off the top of my head. I did not think to write them down. The one I remember, Phantoms by Dean Koontz.
Oh, yes.
And the other one, the one that they decided to go with because of this point light and draw distance limitation, is Stephen King's The Mist.
Which, let me say, I did not realize how big of a deal Stephen King books were. Like, I think in the 70s, and that like getting them translated and stuff like that.
I mean, we already covered Alan Wake, and I feel like it probably would have been something worth covering, is that there was a period in time where you could have a celebrity author. Like, even by 2010, when Alan Wake comes out, the idea of a celebrity author seems kind of weird, like to the level that Alan is in that game, right? That's all based off of Stephen King, baby. Like, I even as a small child, I remember the level of celebrity that Stephen King was.
Oh, no, I completely, I
Mm-hmm.
not only remember, but I agree. Like, that that was a whole time. And there are a lot of like celebrity novelists, and like you could pay to go see one. It's not quite like that anymore.
No, it definitely isn't. And King got to that level fairly quickly where they became international, right? So, we've typically talked about the influence that movies have had on the horror games that we've covered. But, at the same time, I think Stephen King has probably emanated through most of the games that we've covered on this podcast before. And Stephen King had video game adaptations by this point, and I'm sure we'll do podcasts on them someday. Things like some weird ones too, like The Dark Half and whatnot. But what I think is interesting about this one in particular with Silent Hill, number one, it's going to absolutely influence some of the monster designs that end up into the final game. It is going to influence the setting for the game. Another little bit of trivia though, Lamont. Do you know the other game that came out around a little bit before Silent Hill that also was going to originally be a licensed title based off of The Mist?
No, I don't think I do.
Another game we're going to cover in this podcast someday, the original Half-Life.
Oh yeah, I did not know that at all.
Silent Hill, the idea was to just be about Uptown. I don't know that we know if it was going to be a direct adaptation of The Mist or if it was going to take place like during the events that happen in The Mist, like not necessarily based on the same characters or anything. I don't know that they ever got that far for us to know officially, because they spent so much time just trying to get the license, period. Half-Life, which again, we'll do a Half-Life episode one day. But the idea is that like there's a reference in the book that the mist and the monsters may have been the result of some kind of experiment that was happening at a military facility. And the idea behind Half-Life before it became an original IP was, well, what went down at that military facility?
Oh, so that's the origins of Black Mesa.
But yeah, like, so somewhere along the route, trying to get this IP from Stephen King, there's a bunch to do about it. Konami actually changes one of their managers, who's not necessarily on the project, but like one of the, like their project lead, one of the leads at Konami was like, I don't want to bother getting a license for this. Let's just turn it into an original IP.
That's definitely you're right, but I feel like this needs to be said as well. Initially, they were really about making this that licensed title. Like they were gonna send Toyama to the US in order to like have him speak with Stephen King directly to get that license.
Yeah, no, to be clear, there was a lot of effort put in to try and get that Mist license, like a lot of effort. And it really does come down to just, a changing of the guard. that was it. And it was that change and that person looking at this and saying, let's just take what we have, And in that time, you mentioned like wanting to send Toyama out to actually talk to King, and they never got that far, but they did end up having like several trips to America during this period of time, all which have like their own like weird little stories and things. My personal favorite being the one developer who ended up getting lost and alone in, I think it was San Francisco, and then got robbed for like $2.
Oh my god.
Oh no, it was Chicago. They got robbed for like $2 in Chicago.
Yep, I was thinking about that as well. Like, and I will say that is terrifying. Like to be away from your home in a different part of the world where you don't know the language, and to experience something like that is certainly a terrifying experience. And I know that like that had impact. Like that definitely, as an experience like that helped influence that game.
Yeah, for sure. And I think between the different visits from different team members to the US and the fact that, they put so much effort and research looking into United States culture specifically for making a game based off of The Mist, I feel like it was kind of obvious that was what the story would ultimately end up being about, or at least like getting that setting, like that pretty much cemented that, now as an original IP, we're going to like focus here on this setting.
before we started recording, you and I spoke a little about Silent Hill and like the world, the aesthetics of it, and how it is so much like an American town, but at the same time, it is so different. And so like that's something I definitely want to focus on for a moment is like how they created the town of Silent Hill based on everything that they experienced, like, in their visits to the United States, and how it is both utterly an American town, but also completely its own thing.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I'm not the most traveled. I think Lamont, you had a job that allowed you to like see a lot more of the United States than I will ever see in my lifetime. I cannot think of a single town that looks quite like the town of this game, which, one of the things I wanted to dive into when we jump more a little bit more into gameplay is the fact that, you actually do get to explore a town in this game. It's not like, one location like, a very closed claustrophobic location like Resident Evil is. And yeah, like there is this like thing about this town that feels so different and off. Um I will actually. So really quickly, I do have to ask. 'Cause like I said, you're a little bit more traveled than I am. You've seen a lot more of this country than I have. Is there like a town that you could actually compare this one to?
It's funny because having gotten the chance to really drive all around this country, my answer is no. There are elements of the town that I've gotten to experience, like when I was driving across the country, and there is every time you hit a fog, like, and you're in a small town, your first thought is Silent Hill.
Oh yeah, it's a classic joke.
Oh yeah, but I did have an experience on the West Coast driving at night, having to find a motel in the fog. And when we pulled up, like, I was just like, "Oh, no. This right here feels like a piece of Silent Hill." And then I realized, like, kind of in the development, like learning more, like, that's how to build a town. When you're designing a game, you don't base it on a single thing, it's elements. And, like, really thinking about where I've been and, like, the things I've seen, elements of all of those places are Silent Hill, but there's no one place that, like, is a town that is Silent Hill for me. Like, and I say that having visited a lot of towns.
Yeah, at least like a fictional one like this game, and I think it's gonna be the second game that's gonna confirm that Silent Hill takes place in Maine. The haha, Stephen King. Um,
Oh, no, here we go.
I mean, one of the things that I think about, well, I mean, part of what like creates this kind of otherworldly feel, but I've never been 100% sure if it's intentional or not, is that everything feels scaled wrong. Like I don't know if you got a chance to like play this game again for this, but did you notice that it feels like all of the streets are like 3-lane highways and all of the sidewalks are gigantic?
Oh, that's really weird because
It is really weird, and I have no idea if it's intentional or not.
okay. I don't know if you remember, but I was in I was near Chicago.
Oh.
Oh, that's interesting too, considering that the team
Mm-hmm.
was in Chicago. I was taking a walk at night to go get food, and I passed this, like, alleyway, and there are, like, garages or something like that, and I sent you a picture of it because I was like, "No, this is in Silent Hill. I've seen this."
Oh yeah, that's right. And I actually having played the game not too long ago, yeah, absolutely that alleyway is in the game. Like crud.
Yeah, so, like, once again, as I said, elements, but it is weird because you're talking about the scaling thing and having seen what that looks like in real life, seeing that alley or something that is almost identical to it is alarming because even in real life, the scaling feels off.
Interesting. Okay. So it does have some precedence then. I play that game and I'm just kind of like, why are these streets so gigantic? like did Harry like end up in like a city from Gulliver's Travels or something? Like, what is happening here? All right, interesting. Well, more you know. So before we like kind of dive into the specifics for gameplay and like the really like deeper story detail stuff, the thing that I really kind of impresses me the most about the game, just kind of like as a whole, thinking of it holistically, right, is that I feel like this team took every single bit of horror art that they could and just threw it into a pot, and somehow it works. Like, I already kind of said at the top of this that, we, in this podcast, we like to dive into, like, what the influences were on something and talk a little bit about how we, see a little bit of, the game in whatever movie or book that influenced the work. But it's almost impossible to do it here, or at least not to be able to do it in one podcast. Like, you could probably just do like 3 or 4 separate podcasts just on the influence. You could probably just have your own podcast that's just like we're looking at this movie that inspired Silent Hill, right? Because you name a movie, a novel, a painting, even music, right? It's probably represented in here in some way.
Yeah, no, you make a very good point about that.
And yet it works. You brought it up earlier that Muse mentions a lot of stuff that happened in Japan that had, real world stuff that happened in Japan that influences this game. There's the occultism craze, that's one thing, but you also had the university strikes, which also led to an epidemic of bullying, suicide epidemics, a lot of that like really cultural stuff that you see in a lot of Japanese horror. You see that influence in a lot of different things. Like, that's all here. That's all in this game. But typically when we talk about Silent Hill, we talk about it in the way of it is a Japanese take on American horror. I feel like that's how it's usually phrased.
Yeah, no, you make a very good point.
But like at the same time, again, all of these things that are in this game have a Western parallel, sure, but you could also just as easily point to something else. Again, like we haven't dived into like story specifics or anything, but like I'll just like straight out ask you, Lamont, who had more of an influence on Alessa in Silent Hill? Was it Carrie or Sadako from The Ring?
Oh, easily Sadako from The Ring.
See, you say it's easy. I don't think it's easy. Like, I think both of them. You could make a really strong argument for both of them.
I mean, yes, but like, I don't know. On that particular one, I feel like Sadako from The Ring has a little bit more of an influence. And maybe it's because I haven't seen or read Carrie, and like, let me correct that. I have not read Carrie, and I have not seen it in a long time.
What I will say to that is that the more that I'm like saying this out loud and the more that I'm thinking it through in my head, Stephen King wrote Carrie in the 70s, had a very popular movie shortly thereafter. Probably The Ring, Ringu, the novel, is 1991. The answer here is that Sadako is influenced by Carrie.
That is fair.
There's too many parallels, like not just like tortured girl with supernatural powers, but also one that had like strained relationship with a parental figure. In Carrie's case, it's her mother, which again some parallels to Dahlia there in Silent Hill versus her dad in Ringu, and also her mom, who shared a similar power and such. You can see that there are like some shared influence here, right? And I feel pretty strongly that Silent Hill is kind of pulling from both, especially like when you think of the themes of religious fanaticism and how those have an effect on childhood abuse, right? Like that's like almost straight carry.
Okay, yeah, you make a very good point on that.
Yeah, like my overall point, is that us playing Silent Hill in 1999 with no context of the Japanese history, or even the fact that, like, the Japanese horror craze in the United States, also kind of took off with The Ring, but it took off with the American remake. Most of us didn't have that context, and yet Silent Hill still makes sense because we have the other side of the cultural understanding. We have the Western side of it, and like it's just like it mixed all of these things in such a way that it feels right. It doesn't feel off. It doesn't feel like, for lack of a better phrase, weird. Weird is a challenging phrase to use because I know that a lot of Japanese media that we see here in the United States with no cultural context, we just like immediately write it off as weird, which is its own problematic thing. But you don't get that with Silent Hill. It just makes sense because they did such a good job like taking all of these different influences, all of these different movies and books and art and everything, and somehow mixed it into its own thing that turned out to be its own unique piece of work.
I will say, thinking about all of those influences and kind of the melting pot of it, it really is a product of its time. And I say that kind of thinking about the late 90s and the early 2000s and growing up in that and growing up on the internet because like that's a lot of what the developers for for Silent Hill like more or less grew up on the internet and they were in that time. And like, we talk about things like the occult, we talk about the horror movies, we talk about like the industrial scene and the growth of like BDSM culture and stuff like that and how we were starting to really connect globally with the internet and get that exposure. And oh, man, I just lost my train of thought. Oh, snap. Where was I going?
Well, I kind of saw where you were going with it, and I 100% agree. It's going to be an interesting comparison, I think, to the game that we're going to be talking about next month, which very much embodies like the end of that particular period of the 1990s. Whereas, like, I think I agree with if I understand what you're saying properly, that like Silent Hill, the original, kind of feels like the transition point into the 2000s, which has its own vibe, its own aesthetic, and its own feeling that we're really kind of like kind of Silent Hill kind of sits as a bridge of that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And kind of going in between those transition periods, it's a like a pre and post of like the internet and the influence and the reach.
So I guess now is as good a time to just start jumping into like the actual details about what the game is. Like, well, what is this thing? How do you play it? And how does it like kind of fit in the context of its time? And kind of just general overview, first of all, of like what kicks off the events. The main character, Harry Mason, who is an author, is taking his daughter somewhere. I don't think they ever actually say where him and Cheryl are going.
Yeah, I don't think they do.
They're taking a drive, and weird girl pops up in the road. Car accident happens. Harry wakes up in his car. Cheryl, his 8-year-old daughter, is gone. And he gets out of the car and goes to try and find her. And that's when we get control of Harry. And very quickly, we are thrown into, I think the easiest thing that a lot of people fall to is that this game is a Resident Evil like. It's a survival horror, quote unquote. We touched on a little bit in the development section that Konami very specifically was trying to capture the same dollars that Capcom made with Resident Evil by making their own horror game. I think it is worth noting that at the time in the United States, Capcom and Konami had been popular names among people who play video games, which not as many people then as it is now. Konami and Capcom were already pretty established, pretty popular names. And I think in the United States, it was, my feeling always was, Lamont, feel free to agree or disagree with me on this, that Capcom and Konami were kind of two sides of the same coin, in kind of the same way that Nintendo and Sega were.
No, I absolutely agree with you on that.
I will say that, having a better understanding of the history of the two companies overall, from their home country, I think it's a lot more complicated than that in reality. Konami making a quote unquote their own Resident Evil didn't do anything to dissuade that thought. That being said, one thing I think is important to bring up is something that actually was referenced in another YouTuber's video that recently came out, Suzy Sphere Hunter, we mentioned in the Dead Rising podcast as well. She pointed out that it's kind of funny that on the box for the Japanese cover of the original Silent Hill, the box says at the bottom, they call it a horror adventure.
Oh, yes.
Evidently, one of the project names that this had before it had an official title. I was honestly going to talk a little bit about this before I even knew that Konami called it a horror adventure, before the Spear Hunter video even came out. One of the things I wanted to talk about in this podcast is that I really think that title is apt. If we think of a survival horror, typically, like, Lamont, I don't know that we ever actually published the recording that you and me did about, like, what is a horror game.
Oh, yeah, I don't think so.
But, like, a lot of people on the internet go back and forth of, well, is it really a survival horror if it doesn't have, like, resource management and that kind of thing? I mean, if that's the route that you want to go and that's how you want to think about these things, then I think it's actually safe to say that maybe Silent Hill is not a survival horror. It's superficially like Resident Evil, and a lot of people pegged it as a Resident Evil clone, Konami's Resident Evil at the time, because you control your character, Harry Mason around kind of the same way. It is tank controls. It's got some fixed angles, but it is fully polygonal, so it's not all fixed angles, particularly when you're out in Silent Hill.
Yeah.
It's not usually fixed angles. But, like, Resident Evil as a game is about efficiency. That is what that game is about. It takes place in the Spencer Mansion, which is mostly one location. It's got different biomes and such, but it is a much smaller location. It's not like a city. You're not out in Raccoon City like you are in Silent Hill. It is a game about, do I waste my ammo because I don't know if I'm going to get more ammo later? I only have so many bullets. You have to juggle your inventory because you when you're first playing the game, you don't know, am I going to need this extra slot to find something, or do I need to bring this, like, key item with me? Those are all, like, these decisions you have to balance, and it's meant to be replayed a bunch of times to get more and more efficient at it, and there are rewards for clearing it at specific times and whatnot. Silent Hill is not that. Silent Hill, as it says on the box, is a horror adventure. It's more of an adventure game, and honestly, I would go as far as to posit, if I really want to poke the bugbear that is the pedantic internet, that Silent Hill is a Zelda game, or a horror take on Zelda.
No, I see what you mean. Oh, wow.
Yeah, like, you think about it. We have an overworld map, we have dungeons, we have puzzles. The only thing that really keeps it from being like a straight Zelda is that Zelda, like Metroid, is about getting ability upgrades, and the abilities are what open up the map. Beyond that, though, like, it is structurally, its gameplay loop is very Zelda. And on top of that, it's also, the puzzle focus is a lot heavier than Resident Evil. Now, number one, I'm specifically talking about the original Resident Evil here. I would actually do think that some of the later Resident Evils have harder puzzles than Silent Hill. But also, two, Resident Evil's puzzles tend to be very perfunctory. It's very much just like, there are 2 spots on the ground. Push these things on those 2 spots on the ground. They're basically what I would call, as a game designer, I would call them pace breakers. We need to, like, kind of, like, make sure the player is not just, like, stressing out, running around, checking their ammo all the time.
Oh yeah.
They're pace breakers. They're not really meant to like kind of like bust your brain, right? Whereas Silent Hill, I think, is very much about like taking your time, looking at your item, thinking about like areas you saw earlier, either in the world or in a dungeon, and trying to figure out how these different things make sense
Oh
on
yeah.
top of solving riddles. In that way, it's kind of ironic, but if you know anything about the development of Resident Evil, and this is not a Resident Evil podcast, we'll save it for that podcast. But it's kind of ironic that I would argue that Silent Hill is actually closer to Alone in the Dark than Resident Evil is.
No, you make a very good point. Yeah, Silent Hill absolutely like is very much an adventure game. Like when you think about how the puzzles work, the item systems, the fact that like I don't even know, can you run out of space?
No, you can't. There's no inventory management in Silent Hill. Now, to be clear, like, who cares? Genre, who cares? Call Silent Hill a survival horror. And I do think of Resident Evil as an adventure game. Again, we'll talk about Resident Evil on a different day fully, but the way that I've always described the original Resident Evil and why it worked for me when I first played it, like we explained at the beginning of the podcast, is it was an adventure game where I got to shoot stuff. Those point and click, style puzzles and those elements and such are still, Alone in the Dark is still a huge influence on that first Resident Evil. So you can consider it an adventure game, consider it a survival horror and such. I think, to me, the larger point that I guess I'm making here is that I think it's really funny that we consider the original Silent Hill to be Konami's answer to Resident Evil, even though the similarities are mostly superficial. So you get out of your car, you get used to the kind of shaky tank controls. I will say, compared to Resident Evil, probably because this game is a full roaming 3D action adventure game, controls are a little floaty, somewhat intentionally, because the idea is that Harry is an author. He's not like a trained Marine or anything. But they take a little bit more to adjustment to get used to. I think we've mentioned on this podcast that both you and me are completely fine with tank controls. They're perfectly acceptable, and people need to shut up about them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I am 1,000% good with tank controls.
That being said, I will concede that the control in the original Silent Hill takes a little bit more getting used to. You're gonna definitely have your Harry stumble around and run into walls quite a bit in this game, but after you fumble around a little bit, you see the figure of Cheryl off in the distance, kind of getting used to the whole like fog. I don't remember if this is the point where snow starts to fall, or if that happens a little bit later in the intro. So I guess this is as good a time to mention as any. Actually, probably should have mentioned it a little bit earlier. We talked about all of the places that Silent Hill is based off of: Chicago, San Francisco. You know what place it's not based off of, Lamont?
Oh, that place in Pennsylvania that's always burning?
Centralia, Pennsylvania. Sorry, I feel like Masahiro Ito wants us to mention that.
You know what? I think you're right, and we will mention it. It is not based on this.
There might even be a half-decent chance with our small viewership that there is someone out there who might think that. We're setting the record straight here. That was the movie, folks. And in the same vein, the snow that falls in Silent Hill is not ash. It is actually snow. And Harry mentions that it feels out of season. I remember, and I don't know where I heard this, but I remember at some point reading that it's supposed to be July when the original Silent Hill takes place, but I have no idea where I read that, and I might have made that up. The point is that it's snowing out of season. This is all a long way to get to like probably the big moment that everyone talks about and everyone remembers in the game is when you get to the alleyway where you see Cheryl run into, and we get our first taste of a fixed camera angle, but it's a moving fixed camera angle, as opposed to like Resident Evil, which are all static shots, because they're doing a very similar thing that we talked about in the Alone in the Dark podcast, where it's all just like very still imagery. Silent Hill, fully rendered polygonal 3D game, pushing the PlayStation to its absolute limits. You walk into this alleyway, and then suddenly it's a top-down shot, and the camera is going crazy. It's just like kind of swinging around as you run through the alley and then round the corner as Harry. And I gotta say, too, like, one of the things that this game does very well for a game with tank controls is that, like, you're only a little bit disoriented with the camera when the camera changes, like, angles radically from the last camera angle. Typically, that's a big problem, especially with games in the mold of Resident Evil and Silent Hill, which switch the direction of the analog controls based off of what the camera angle is and not what the player was doing in the last scene. Which then, like, you change camera angle and then suddenly your character's moving in a direction you don't want them to move. Resident Evil does not have that problem. Silent Hill doesn't have that problem, and it's particularly impressive with this shot, with this top-down shot of the alleyway where the camera is, like, swinging, almost swaying along with Harry's movements as they round the L corner and go down the way, and then suddenly everything gets dark. The street turns to rusted grating, and you walk up to something that you can't see, and then you turn the light on, and there is a skinned, what looks to be, again, this is a PlayStation 1 game, skinned alive human without any kind of face. Absolutely, like, Lamont, you talk about, like, one of the scariest moments in a horror game. I cannot think of a more effective bit of horror off the top of my head. And I don't even think the original Silent Hill is the scariest Silent Hill game, but I would still say that I don't know that there's ever been a moment quite as good as that whole running through the alley up to the other world change. We'll talk more about the other world in a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
To seeing that figure. And that's before we even get to the children that come out and attack you.
Oh, man. So when it comes to, like, I guess, iconic game moments, I find that one to be, like, very high on my list. There was something so interesting about the camera and, like, how that worked. And I remember later in my life playing through that opening, knowing what was gonna happen and trying to, like, go forward a little, go back a little, see, like, where it changes, see if I can mess with the camera. And it's so tight and so well done that, like, I do still think about that scene. And, and it's jarring because, like, when it starts, you're in the fog, you're in the bright point of Silent Hill, and you're going through and the camera changes, and it's gradually getting darker. And at some point, you realize that everything's black. Like, as far as the sky and everything around you, it's all black. And and the gates are rusting, and that body, and it's a dead end. And the moment that you're like, "Oh shit, I need to turn back around," you are punished for it.
Yeah, and the kids just, like, come out, like, immediately and start grabbing your ankles. One of the things that I was nervous about coming into this podcast is that it is extremely difficult to find anything about this game that hasn't already been said. And we are talking about a moment that, like, is probably, like, one of the biggest moments in the game. I mean, it really is the mission statement of what you're going to be experiencing throughout this video game, that is just going to be moments like this, just really well directed, really interesting moments. And, another thing that strikes me is I mentioned that there are so many different movies and books and pieces of art that are referenced and mentioned and clearly influence this game. And at the same time, they never do anything in Silent Hill quite like anything else. I think it's a pretty typical thing that when you take a look at a piece of Japanese media that has had American influences, it's very easy to start pointing to direct parallels. Even looking at Silent Hill 2 with, say, Maria's outfit looks exactly like Christina Aguilera's outfit from the 1997 Kids' Choice Awards, that kind of thing. Like, almost everything in this first game feels unique to itself. Familiar, clearly, like, influenced, but still its own. And, like, I don't want to talk too much about the Silent Hill movie in this particular podcast, but, the film does recreate this scene basically shot for shot, and it's nowhere near as effective, oddly, even though, like, I feel like what they're trying to do with the camera angles and the lead up to the reveal of the figure is essentially, like, mimic the kind of film techniques that, thrillers and horror of the 60s and 70s were doing. But again, they just do it in such their own unique way, and the film mostly tries to just recreate the moment. And I don't know that it's as effective as it is here in this game.
No, I don't think so. But I will say, and I don't know if we're gonna bring this up later, but, like, a lot of this first Silent Hill gives you that dream logic of everything is not quite right. And I even feel like that with, like, looking at those camera angles and looking at, like, how that scene works out. The movie, I think, plays it in a way that takes away the dream logic.
Mm.
The game still gives you that, like, this is a dream, this is a nightmare, this is not quite right.
Yeah, and I think that aspect plays into another element that's worth mentioning as we kind of move past that moment and get to the diner, when we actually do start to get other characters introduced. First with Sybil Bennett, and that initial conversation between her and Harry. It is mentioned in the Muse documentary that they told all of the voice actors to pause in between each line. Something I absolutely noticed playing the game the first time. Now, they did tell the actors that there were technical reasons for that, something to do with the PlayStation loading and such, but as Muse mentions in the video, that explanation doesn't feel like it holds up if you compare, other games on the PlayStation that were able to do voice acting continuously just fine. So there's a possibility that it was an intentional choice to try and create that, like, kind of otherworldly feel that I think you're getting at here. What I will say, Muse is, I think, very kind to the idea that, like, a lot of the reviews at the time mentioned that the voice acting in this game is not very good. And, all of the voice actors in the game are professional voice actors who had years of experience prior to doing the voices in the original Silent Hill. And yeah, I think that maybe possibly the decision to just have, like, the pauses between lines was intentional. I agree with that. I think that as a voice actor, you might be able to talk more about this, Lamont. It would be very hard to, like, get a flow and to, like, make voices sound natural if you had to pause between each line.
No, that is so difficult, and, like, having done voice acting and read scripts and, like, having to purposely put a pause both at the beginning and the end of whatever you're doing, and in between is so jarring because, like, when you're reading the script, when you're reading that scene, like, you wanna put whatever energy, whatever, like, emotions in, but then you also have to stilt it because it's like, "Oh, wait, no, didn't put that second pause in." You have to be very aware of it, and that really takes away from what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
That said, as Muse, kind of went into, one of the influences is Twin Peaks. And, like, when I go back to Twin Peaks and I listen to some of the scenes, especially with, like, the giant and when we're in the Velvet Room, my goodness, the Red Lodge. Almost I went full persona. But when we're in the lodge, there's a lot of that weird stilted dialogue that goes on, and I think that really is one of the influences that they're wearing right on their sleeve that like kind of went over the head.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, number one, very clearly, Twin Peaks, also a huge deal in Japan, clearly had an influence on Silent Hill and the later games as well. And I think that that might be playing a role in the decision to have the characters pause the way that they do. I think that in Twin Peaks, you usually typically see that with otherworldly characters like the giant and so on forth. Here, these are like every character talks like that. And also, I don't know. I don't think that I would go as far to say, and I don't know if it has to do with the pauses or not. I just don't think the acting in this game is very good. It's fine. I mean, I don't have a problem with the fact that it's bad. It doesn't hurt my enjoyment of the game like at all. But like despite all of that, even with that context, even if it's true, then I hear a line like, in that case, I have to find her now. Cheryl's my little girl, like, and I'm just like, no, you can only justify this so far. Like, better than the original Resident Evil? Yeah, sure, absolutely, but that's not saying much. Especially like by the time we're in 1999, we're already post Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear Solid also, to be fair, was a cut above most things for a few years. So it's not really a fair comparison, ultimately. But I wouldn't go as far to say that the acting is good. I don't think it matters, but also I wouldn't call it good.
I am definitely curious about like the direction when it came to that acting because like
Always a question of voice direction.
yeah, because thinking about like Harry's voice and the fact that he was
The voice of
Dracula.
I was gonna say the voice of Dracula in Symphony of the Night. I think there's probably gonna be some people listening to this who might scoff at the idea of like that particular, Symphony of the Night. Symphony of the Night is another one that's infamously known to be like a bad voice acting, and even to the localization director who wrote those lines, Jeremy Blostein, I know has had some angry stuff to say about that particular scene. The Dracula part, which I only learned from the Muse video, was the same voice as Harry Mason. That those lines are good. I mean, the writing's not good, but the reading is great.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like that delivery, so good.
By the way, again, we'll do a Symphony of the Night podcast someday, or a Castlevania one. Maybe we don't do a whole one on just one Castlevania. But do you know who voices Richter in that scene?
I don't.
I don't have their name on hand, but it's the voice actor of Chris Redfield from Resident Evil.
Oh yeah, did not know that.
Yeah, that's which is why you get such wonderful. I feel bad about this because that voice actor also died recently, but it's also why you get wonderful line readings like "Mankind ill needs a savior such as you." Classic stuff. I love that, man. I'm sorry. I don't mean to make fun of the dead. Yeah, no. If you go through the credentials of all the voice actors and such in the original Silent Hill, like they are professionals and they had been doing it for years and they have examples of good stuff that they have done. So, it's not to beseech them. It probably has more to do with the direction, and I don't know that it's entirely to be blamed on the pausing. The acting's just it's fine. It's serviceable. But it does lend to the feel. I will say, like, whether intentionally or not, it does lend to the feel. I think that stuff like radio, what's going on with that radio, absolutely helps keep this game be iconic in the same way that, like, the really good B-movie classics, like, not just, like, B movies in terms of they're so bad they're good. Like, no, like, the actually good B movies.
Yeah, no, I completely understand what you mean.
Let's talk about that radio for a little bit. One of the big gimmicks of the first Silent Hill, compared to other horror games at the time, was this idea that, you get the radio pretty early on. They have a pretty iconic scene that is sort of Silent Hill's version of the dog jumping through the window, where they fake you out with a breaking glass before the true monster burst through the window sequence happens. But they preface this by showing you this radio has static when things are close by. And it's been a trope of the Silent Hill games pretty much since then. With rare spin-off exceptions like Book of Memories and Shattered Memories, generally speaking, the idea is the radio helps you keep an idea of like when monsters are around. Lamont, do you find the radio to be particularly helpful at all?
No, honestly, I really don't.
Me either. Like it keeps you on your toes, definitely. I really feel like it gets touted as a gameplay feature. I really feel that radio is more there to make you freak out more than anything else.
No, I think that you're absolutely right. I think the radio's purpose is to help, like, build suspense. Like, to, like it kicks in and you're like, "Okay, something's around." But at the same time, is it really around, or are you just trying to scare me?
Well, like I think the thing is that I think it is really around, but the question, it doesn't really give you a good sense of what's its distance to you, how many monsters there are, because it has like several different sound effects and crackles that it can go through, and it's really hard to like really get a sense of like what sound means what thing, if that makes any sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense. I honestly didn't even notice that it had different sounds for different, like
Yeah, the sound design on the radio is really good in that it's freaky. I do not consider it a very helpful feature. Other than just to be like, oh goodness, something's here.
let me brace myself to be scared.
I also think between us talking about the intro sequence and now like we're actually out in the town, we have a gun, we're fighting monsters and things. Man, this game just looks so good.
It looks incredible. It was so, like, ahead of its time.
Yeah, it's don't get me wrong, it's grim, it's gross, but it looks good, especially for being a PlayStation 1 game, especially for being a PlayStation 1 game that is full 3D, no pre-rendered backgrounds whatsoever. They just nail the look of this game, and I have to admit, this is the part where as someone who likes to like look at these things and break them down, analyze them, I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage. My weak spots are things like architecture and fine arts and all of the things that like someone like say a Masahiro Ito absolutely uses in their influence when like creating environments and creating textures and things like that. It's hard for me to give a proper analysis of things like the world and the artistic styles that they're pulling from to achieve that kind of look. But the fact that I can like look at this and be like, this is clearly the work of people who have been very, very influenced by all of these different elements on a freaking PlayStation 1 game is incredible.
Oh my god, absolutely.
Yeah. And the other thing too is that I think this particular Silent Hill, we kind of alluded to this at the top, the look of the town itself, the look of the other world, and the monster designs are all unique to this particular game. Like there are elements of what will eventually be the established Silent Hill look moving into Silent Hill 2 and 3 in a couple years down the road. But for the most part, I would say that this game kind of very much looks like itself. It doesn't really look that recognizable to the future Silent Hill games. Monster designs, everything is fleshy.
Oh yeah.
There's gonna be a lot more use of things like bags and like burlap sacks and whatever material straight jackets are made of and things like that in the future Silent Hill games. Here we have skinless animals, fleshy children with knives, weird alien looking mantis creatures in the sewers.
Oh yeah, I forgot about them.
There are like, this is such a unique looking game that I don't know. It just has a very different look. It has a different sound to it. I feel like Akira Yamaoka clearly very much nailing those nailing getting those 9 Inch Nails vibes with this very industrial kind of sound whenever you're in like a really horrific moment, or for particular like rooms where we're gonna have like where it's gonna be very monster heavy and such. I mean, I will say you might have a better a different feel for this, because you are a little bit more music literate than I am. Especially when I was in high school, especially when I was playing this game for the first time. I was very music ignorant. And I actually hadn't listened to a lot of Trent Reznor stuff, or any kind of industrial music. Silent Hill sounded like nothing I had ever heard before.
Um, no, I will agree with you on that one, and I have to also, like, kinda say that music literacy, like, was a musician. I played the alto sax from, like, 4th grade until I graduated high school, but, like, getting into, like, the real industrial rock scene and stuff like that, like, I didn't grow up in that. I grew up in, like, a lot of, like, the hip hop, R&B, like, the rock scene that I was, kind of touching, like, I really liked rock music, but, it was a different time.
Hmm.
That's the best way I can put it, like, being young and black and in the early '90s, me and the rock scene, like, were a little we're it was a little weird in that, like, I loved the rock scene, but the culture did not want me to love the rock scene.
That makes sense. It was something you discovered a little bit later on from this period.
Yeah. And so, like, I once I got into high school, I think more, I stopped caring about the culture and I was like, "You know what? I'm just gonna like what I like and we'll go from there." But even with that, it was still, like, more of, like, what was in the pop scene, and industrial wasn't really in the pop scene, like, 9 Inch Nails and stuff like that was not, like, I was kind of on the outside of that. I the best I can say is that hanging out with, like, Matt, like, hanging out with Matt Birnbach back in the day, that was he was my introduction into things like 9 Inch Nails and a little more of the industrial scene and like that, and that was maybe, like, closer to my sophomore year of, like, high school, where, like, I was like, "Oh, no. Now I see it. Now I understand what this is."
Okay, got it. Yeah, though that makes sense, and actually kind of funny because that, with some exception to our pre-high school background, there's some parallels there. So it sounds like you and me kind of discovered some of these influences a little bit later on around the same time, which is actually really interesting. I was gonna say then, not a big Sonic Youth fan, I'm guessing.
No, no.
The one band that gets a shout out in Silent Hill, the teacher Kay Gordon, is you find their notes and eventually get the key to their house in the first dungeon, the school. Kay Gordon, named after Kim Gordon from Sonic Youth, the one music shout out that I know of.
Yeah, definitely, that went over my head.
And I still have never listened to any Sonic Youth. Get at me in the comments. Should I listen to Sonic Youth, or am I not missing anything? But my larger point, I guess, in the end of this is just to say that, like, this is a fairly unique looking game, even in hindsight, even when we do look at some of the later games and some of the later sequels. But again, for a PlayStation 1 game that came out in 1999, like, just incredible stuff. And I think it's been pointed out before that it's also pushing the PlayStation 1 to its absolute limits to be able to do things like a fully realized 3D world. The game definitely does chug a little bit when you start to get like a couple of monsters on screen, but it never feels unplayable is the fun part.
Oh, yeah, no, you're absolutely right about that.
I hesitate to use the word gimmick, but it is like a very important part of what I feel why this game stuck around, why people remembered this game, and what pushed Konami to greenlight a sequel is the concept of the other world. So we've mentioned a couple times. Let's talk about what the other world actually is. So
Oh, I was waiting for you to talk about this.
yeah, absolutely. Let's now. I'm very stoked because I think this is really what makes this game. That like there's two things that make this game. God, what doesn't make Silent Hill Silent Hill? There's three things that make Silent Hill Silent Hill. There is its approach to storytelling, its look and feel and vibe, and then finally is really this gameplay element, this idea of the other world. So, in the first dungeon, it kind of happens in the intro. We touched a little bit on the intro. It arguably happens right before you go into this dungeon, but no, I want to focus specifically on this dungeon. In the school, it's sort of a pretty straightforward dungeon. The school is made up of 3 different floors. It's sort of a square. There are 3 puzzles that you have to do in order. So you have to like find the room where the puzzle is in. You have to solve the puzzle. You have to get an item. You bring it to a clock tower, and then you go to solve a different puzzle. And you do that 2 more times, and that unlocks the door to the clock tower in this outdoor courtyard in the middle of the school. You go through one end of it. It's just this little tiny hallway with 2 ladders on each end. So you go down a ladder, you go down a hallway, you go up a ladder, you go through a different door, and you're back in the courtyard. And now it is dark. It is rainy. It is not clear that you didn't just like turn around and end up back where you originally started at that point. The only difference is that there is what can only be described as a magical sigil with a triangle and snake in the middle of it outside in this dark courtyard that was definitely not there before. That's your only indication that anything is different. It's not really until you walk into the school where suddenly you notice now it's a lot more dilapidated than it used to be. The floor has been replaced by the floor and walls really have been replaced by rusted, bloody fences. Rooms are now completely different. What used to be pretty typical elementary school classrooms are now just large empty cages with a scattering of desks and chairs just kind of like wherever in the room. The music is a lot more sharp, it's a lot more violent, and I don't remember when they start calling it the other world. It may happen a little bit later in the game. It might have been just a name that fans gave to the area that stuck. It might have been internal documentation. But this idea of essentially a parallel world to ours, which number one, just a really great way to like kind of reuse your level designs and such, but also something that just sticks in everyone's mind that you kind of have to do, the dungeon twice. You have to do, and this is true of all the dungeons in the game, and there's not too many. There's only like 3 plus the final area. You kind of have to go through it again in this much more nightmarish area where all sorts of different special and scary events happen. It's not 100 it feels a lot more dangerous, whether or not it actually is. Yeah, it was just an incredible moment that doesn't really have too much parallel in game. So I guess like Lamont, I have to ask, like you said you played this game, roughly around the time that it came out, from through a rental and such. You mentioned, the school being like the most scared you had been into a game at that point. Do you remember, to the best of your ability, do you remember like the moment you first entered that other world?
I vaguely remember that moment.
Sounds like a therapy session.
I know, right? Like, is this a repressed memory? It's been a long time. Yes, I remember that change. I remembered the change from like normal Silent Hill into the other world and the darkness that is that. And give a little something about me. In those days, I've always loved horror games, and I've mentioned that, but I don't know if I've said it out loud, but I'm a little bit of a weenie when it comes to horror games. Like I get scared very easily. So my constant partner in crime was always my sister Chloe. Chloe is like always been my number 2. Whenever it came to horror games, like and puzzles, and if like I wasn't feeling confident or if I needed someone to like pull up a game FAQs and like help me run through it, like Chloe was always there as like my navigator. And I'm pretty sure it's the same for Silent Hill. So like I was terrified when like we switched to the other world, and I know that Chloe was there to be like, "All right, cool. This is scary, but we're gonna make it through together, and I have a guide for you." But yes, no, I remember it. Like it's not a vivid memory, but it is a memory that like kind of sticks where I'm like, "No, I remember just being so uncomfortable." And I think that's the biggest thing with like the other world portion is that once again it gets to like we go into dream logic, we go into nightmare mode, but there's so much discomfort involved with it, and I think that's the biggest thing when it comes to that.
First of all, shout out to Chloe. Hi, Chloe. Second of all, no, I feel like discomfort is a great way of phrasing what the feeling of what the other world is. I don't remember too much. I mean, I do remember like being like, whoa, it was definitely a big whoa moment. Almost as much as like a little bit later on in the hospital level, like right before the transition happens, you go into the like in the normal world, you go into the elevator, you go to, there's only 2 buttons, you go to floor 1, then you go in, it's like a door's locked, you have to go back in the elevator, and then there's a third button. That's the other big whoa moment for me. But that first like, yeah, that first like kind of like crossing the threshold moment in the school definitely was also like this like real mind blow. But yeah, from there everything is just made to make you feel uncomfortable. Now what I will say, I used to be a weenie. Like I liked, like honestly, if there's something I'll say, it's that I kind of miss being a weenie. It used to be that I would play a horror game like a Silent Hill and have like that kind of same feeling of, oh god, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this. And I had mentioned like the music, that industrial sound did not sound like anything I had ever sound before. Like I would go into, and I'm the kind of person who like I want that full feeling. Like I typically and back then absolutely did would turn the lights off and play the game in the dark. And the music intensified that feeling. Absolutely intensified it. Like you go into certain rooms and you would just start to hear like doom, 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 and it's just like I'm like holding my head like, oh my god, make it stop. I just want to get out of this room because
Oh
of just
god,
like
yeah.
how like loud and off-putting the sound would get, on top of the fact that you're just in these like horrific looking scenes and sequences. And again, like I don't know that Silent Hill has, well, I was gonna say I don't know if I was going to say I don't know if Silent Hill has ever felt as oppressive as the otherworld moments in this first game. I think there are some arguments that Silent Hill 2 does get that feeling in certain places, but it's certainly not the primary feeling that I feel like is absolutely the kind of that primary feel of this game. And the other world is just goes a long way of doing that. And it's not just like the overall look and the overall feel, but also there's just a lot of horrific stuff that happens that are like these like bespoke moments of terror, of a phone call on a dead phone from Cheryl that's like very staticky, the dead body falling out of the locker, moments like that just litter the other world, just like add to that uncomfortable feeling of that there's just going to be a threat around every corner, when functionally it plays the same as everything else. So I mentioned the the intro to the game and how the intro goes to kind of get us into talking about the gameplay a little bit and what the structure of the game was, and to be able to talk about the look and feel and the other world and things like that. I don't really have much I want to say about the overall story and plot of this game that a million people have not dissected. One of the challenges of doing a Silent Hill podcast is what is there to say that hasn't been said about this game? And with the story in particular, this is one of the first video games that I know of where the plot is not explicitly, clear when you beat the game. And it's not explicitly clear when you get the other endings in the game. And this game has a really unique approach to multiple endings. But even when you see all of the endings and everything, there is no just straight up, here is an explanation of what's going on. This is one of the first games I know that kind of took that like film-like approach. It didn't want to answer too many questions because that's what makes the game intriguing. That's what makes the story feel good. And this is honestly one of the first games I also can think of for all the Gen Z people out there who watch 4-hour Five Nights at Freddy's lore videos. This is one of the first games that I really remember that like there was sort of a culture of trying to analyze and dissect every little bit of this game. And Lamont, you mentioned you and Chloe like reading guides and stuff off of game FAQs. There was a really popular document by someone who went by the name President Evil.
But
that I remember I pored over this document. I pored over it. And this is, because it went really deep into not just like what the heck's going on in this game. Well before we had your screen rant, looper, whatever, like ending explained, long before that kind of clickbaity blog culture-y thing that's a thing now. Like, but this guy, this President Evil guy, didn't just, like kind of give an overview of the story and kind of trying to connect the dots and everything. It also went into like, well, this is probably a reference to this film. This is probably a reference to this film. It was like the first time I ever even heard the words Jacob's Ladder came from reading, I have it opened actually right now, Silent Hill Plot Guide, an explanation of the complete plot of Silent Hill, which was first posted, according to the version notes that are left on the Game FAQs document file, March 1st, 1999.
Insane.
Yeah, and like it was updated throughout up into January 2001, and then there was a final update 4 years later on July 28th of 2005. But I remember poring over this document as I kept playing through the game, and I tried to get all the different endings, and I like read it and everything. And the even crazier thing is that like since this document was written, there have been supplementary material that's come out. Then there was the Silent Hill 2, which itself is kind of a disconnected story. One of the things that, again, it's not like, they had a lot of open questions in this game, but the open questions were not there because they were going to do a sequel to this game. They didn't even know if they were ever going to do a sequel to it. Like, this game, in and of itself, Silent Hill 1 is meant to be a complete work.
Mm-hmm.
And it was only after, they saw that, okay, Silent Hill 2 didn't do as well, okay, Silent Hill 3 then is a direct sequel, that, like, this guide back in 1999 got, like, most of the details right. So shout out to President Evil, who actually does go by the name Dan Birlew, and I looked them up prior to us doing this recording. Still doing this shtick on Blue Sky. Just talking about, like, the Silent Hill 2 remake and Alan Wake 2 and kind of doing the same thing that he's been doing since 1999. But yeah, like number one, so that's number one. That's one thing I wanted to mention is that like I cannot think of another game that took that kind of like film-like approach of like this is a complete work. We're not going to give you all the answers. A lot of it is through inference. A lot of it through is the documents that you read, environmental storytelling, but we're not going to paint the complete picture. You have to, like, whether you, but like, and I don't know that they did it specifically because they wanted people to decipher it or not. I just think that's just an effective form of storytelling that you usually see in movies. You don't usually see in video games.
Yeah.
The other thing, typically Silent Hill 2 gets a lot of credit for being an adult game. It is a game that is not meant for children, which, video games historically, especially back then, used to get pigeonholed for. And not just because in terms of its gameplay, not just because it's a violent horror game, but because of the themes that it explores in its story. Silent Hill 2 very particularly covers a lot of really heavy topics, when Silent Hill 1 was also tackling some really heavy themes, from single parenthood, having feelings of being a parent of an adopted child, religious fanaticism, and how that religious fanaticism can lead to things like child abuse. All of the things that we mentioned might have been partially inspired by some of what had gone on in Japan over the last couple of decades prior to the game being released. The developers saw in their lifetime. All of these topics are not just in Silent Hill. They're also not just, perfunctory. They're not just there for simple texture. They do give them the same weight and care that, like, a genuinely good work of horror does. I hesitate to use the term elevated horror. I kind of think that phrase is a little stupid, honestly. We had movies like The Omen. We had movies like Rosemary's Baby and even Jacob's Ladder before, Hereditary or whatever. Elevated horror is kind of a stupid term. That's my soapbox on that.
No, I've never even heard of elevated horror, and now, like, I hear it and I'm like, okay, so are we just trying to call it, like, I don't know, sophisticated horror?
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially what they try to get at elevated horror. It's a phrase that came out around. It's the kind of thing that it's like, oh, horror movies are actually getting, like, popular now, like mainstream popular for things not just like, and not just like your what are those movies, like your Insidiouses or whatever, but stuff like Hereditary, right? I don't think it started. I don't think the trend started with Hereditary, but like, people started using, it might have been Babadook or something like before Babadook. People started using the phrase elevated horror to, like, separate it from, like, slasher movies and such. But again, movies that have a little bit that take a little bit of thought and care into their themes have existed for years in this genre. And we're gonna mention The Burning again, folks.
The Burning.
We've mentioned that we don't like movies like The Burning and whatnot, like the really trashy stuff, but, like, subsets of horror, including, like, stuff that have things that they're trying to say and actually do a good job of it, looking at you, Harvester, existed well before, horror movies of the 2010s or whatever. And, like, Silent Hill, to its credit, also does a really good job handling these topics. I don't think it, does everything perfectly, but at the same time, the fact that it does approach them and it is very mindful of them, and maybe part of that is because it's all coming from really good source material. But yeah, I think that, like, Silent Hill 1 is also can be included in this game that really was looking to be a little bit more than just an action adventure. So, Mont, do you have any final words on Silent Hill before we try to get out of this town, though I'm sure we'll just circle back into it again one way or the other?
I don't have much to add. And I say that in that I did a lot of research on the game, but I didn't go back to it in a way that I feel like I should have. But I appreciate Silent Hill for all of the things that it did different. And for me, hearing the story about how this game was made and all of the influences really took me back to like why I wanted to be a game design major and to make games and to explore that art form. I am appreciative of this podcast and this work and that learning, that research, because it reminds me not only why I like games, but why I wanted to be a part of that industry.
Yeah, for sure. And like this is a game that I feel like we have so much information on. Again, thank you, Gaming Muse, for all the work you did compiling all of that information into one place. That like you really kind of like the Alone in the Dark podcast, honestly. I feel that this research was somewhat similar to that, in that we got a really full capture of what like each step of the development process was like, and how the unique influences across, again, all of this media led to what ultimately is such a special game. I said that at the top of the podcast, Resident Evil was the game that made me want to get into game development as a adventure game that really had this like very cinematic feel and felt very different from any other game that I had played. The irony again of Silent Hill is a game that typically gets lumped into being a Resident Evil clone, of which there were a ton. Maybe one day we'll do the Men in Black Resident Evil clone as an episode. That'll be fun.
I do not remember that.
Oh, that was totally a thing. Silent Hill, like I said before, is a very unique work compared to other games of its ilk. And part of what makes it so unique, again, is that combined cultural influence and all of these different developers taking these things that they love and making something wholly unique out of them, remixing them into something that is its own unique work. And so what I'll say, I always feel like I say this at the conclusion of all of these episodes, but like this is absolutely a game that is completely playable today. Yes, there are tank controls, but you will get used to them. This game is also way easier than a lot of YouTubers, and a lot of people are working off their old memory and didn't go back to play it. This game is actually pretty easy. It gives you tons of ammo. It wants you to beat it. The puzzles are not that bad as an adult. Yes, even the piano puzzle is not that difficult. It's a great game. 2 is still my favorite. This one is pretty high up there. It is I do like it better than 3 for now. Maybe I'll change my mind when we go back to do Silent Hill 3 someday. Yeah, no, this is a very unique game that also, like, kind of like Lamont said, like, reminds me why I like video games and what makes video games unique, even when they take so much influence from media that is not video games. Shall we talk about what we're doing next month?
You know what, Adrian? I am so excited. It is a Jingle Bells kind of situation. We are getting mistletoe deep into Parasite Eve.
Mistletoe deep, huh?
I don't know.
That sounds dirty.
It does sound dirty.
Which, having read the book Parasite Eve, might be kind of appropriate, which also does take place at Christmas, so it all fits. Probably the only Christmas episode we'll ever do outside of those terrible Steam Slender Man Christmas ripoffs. But yeah, I'm so excited to be able to cover Parasite Eve, a game that I love, but also an opportunity to get to talk about stuff like Squaresoft and RPGs and other things that are not horror games that I could talk about for hours. It's going to be a real good time.
It really is. I'm absolutely looking forward to that one. As a big fan of RPGs and turn-based RPGs, honestly, I'm willing to bet that this is going to be the Christmas gift for both of us.
It absolutely is. I can't wait to share it with you. As much as I'm ready to share with all of you that if you enjoyed this podcast, you should go to your podcast listening service of choice and rate and review us. Seriously, 5-star reviews always help get us attention, get us up in the algorithm. That being said, if you are not able to do that, you can always support us directly on Patreon by going to www.patreon.com/playingdread. You could also follow us on social media, and you can find all access to all of our social media channels on www.playingdread.com. Or simply just tell your friends. If you enjoyed this podcast and you know anybody else who likes horror games who might enjoy this, please give us a shout out there. But yeah, with that, I'm Adrian Sandoval.
And I'm Lamont Williams.
And we have been playing Dread. Thank you and good night. You've been listening to Playing Dread, a Q27 media production and a member of the New Jersey Horror Collective, hosted by Lamont Williams and Adrian Sandoval. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell your friends, or just consider leaving us a review and giving us top ranks on your podcast listening service of choice. Check out our show notes at playingdread.libsym.com and consider becoming a Playing Dread patron on Patreon. Social media links including YouTube, Blue Sky, Instagram, and more can be found at www.playingdread.com. All music is under a Creative Commons Attribution license. The intro music is The Curse of the Dolls by Jeff Harvey, and other music in this episode was performed by Alex Grohl, Dimitri Taras, Grand Project, and Pump Up the Mind.